Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're with us here today. Let's open our Bibles to Genesis 37, please. Our study will be walking through several chapters in the book of Genesis, the first book of your Bibles, and so please open it up to Genesis 37, and we'll begin our study here in just a moment. If you're visiting with us today, we're glad that you're here. We consider you as our guests and our friends, and we're delighted that you've come our way. We'd love to be a blessing to you if we can, and so if we can help you or encourage you in any way, let us know. We're just glad that you've come here to worship God with us and to learn more about our God with us. We have many of our own that are out of town and many who are traveling this week, and so our prayers ought to go out for each other, that we remain safe in our holiday ventures. And so as family comes in and family goes out, let's just continue to think about each other during this good season. There's a story I love, heard a couple years ago, and it just fits these sort of tones of lessons so well. There's this bird named Chippy the parakeet. His owner had it, and it was just this precious little bird. It would sit on this little perch, content to swing and sing all day long. Well, one day, the owner decided to clean out the cage, and so she got the hose attachment to the vacuum and put it into the bottom of the vacuum and was sucking out all of the mess in the bottom of the cage. Well, the phone rang, and so she turned to answer the phone, and right when she said hello, Chippy went into the vacuum, went down into the vacuum bag, didn't know what the swoop was. So immediately she dropped the phone and ran to the vacuum and opened it up and opened up the bag, and then there was Chippy, stunned, sitting there. The bird was covered in all sorts of the stuff that collects inside the vacuum bag, and so she did the only thing she could think of, and that was running Chippy to the bathroom and holding him under the faucet and rinsing off all the stuff off the bird. Well, then the bird was shivering and was cold, and so she did the only thing she could think, and that was getting out the hairdryer and blasting that poor bird with a big old puff of air. That poor bird didn't know what hit him. Well, what's interesting was someone heard about this story. A news reporter actually heard about this, and so he went to the owner, and he was asking questions. And one of the questions was, how's the bird today? How's Chippy doing? And the owner simply said, well, he doesn't sing as much as he used to. Can you blame him? One day you're sitting there swinging and singing, and then the next you're sucked into a vacuum and you're put under a raging river in a faucet, and then you're blown over with a hairdryer. If that doesn't steal your song, I'm not sure what will. I love that poor little parakeet. Here's the thing I like about Chippy. That's us. I mean, have you had those days when it seems like everything that could go wrong did go wrong and then continued to go wrong? In fact, have you ever felt like there are seasons in your life when you were just the target of bad news? You just almost regret and cringe every time the phone rings because you're not sure what it's going to be this time. In fact, for some of us, it may seem like this season of our life, this time of year, which on the radio says it's the most wonderful time of the year, sometimes it's the most difficult time of the year. This is a time sometimes with family, or sometimes in the memories of loss that we face great strife, difficulty, discouragement. Sometimes in light of things that go wrong in our lives, we find ourselves spiraling out of control. Bad news after bad news. Sometimes, and maybe you've been there before, it feels like we just kind of hit the bottom. You know what the bottom feels like? There are high moments in life, births, graduations, weddings, times we get family together and you take pictures. Most of life is right in the middle. There's school days, there's work days, there's appointments and clubs. It's just middle day living. But sometimes we hit the bottom, and we're there in the low moments of life, the deep, dark valleys, the dark places. Maybe it's losing a job that I was relying on to see through for many more years to get to retirement. Or maybe it's getting that bad news from the doctor I wasn't ready for, and now everything's going to change because of this news. Or maybe it's something with the kids. The kids decided to do something, a child is rebellious or prodigal, and now I'm having to face and handle a new situation as a parent with a child who's choosing to go his own way. Or maybe it's a loved one who passed away unexpectedly, and now I'm forced to be in a place of mourning and grief and suffering I wasn't there before. Today I want to just offer a word of hope. A word of hope that comes through the life of Joseph, and the word is this. It's on the screen. You'll get through this. I think if there's anything that God is teaching us through the story of Joseph, it's this. You will get through this. Joseph, when he is introduced in the book of Genesis 37, is around 17 years old. And Joseph's story is fascinating, not unique to most of us. 14 chapters of the book of Genesis are devoted to his story, same amount as Abraham. He didn't write any books. Jesus never mentioned Joseph. The apostles never really talked about Joseph. He's only found 4 times in the New Testament, but if there's anyone more like Jesus, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find someone more than Joseph. We're going to pick up in Genesis 37. What I want you to do today is I want you to just walk through some chapters of suffering in Joseph's life and notice how in many ways, this young man had gone through in his young years what many of us have gone through, and many here have gone through. Your suffering, your experiences. 17 years old, I want you to notice a few things. Number one, he knew the pain of a dysfunctional family. And so Genesis 37, beginning in verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that the father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more." Joseph knew the pain of a family of dysfunctional, unloving, unharmonious family. Not only did he lose his mother at a young age, now because dad chose him to be the favorite, all of his brothers hate him. And then he gets this divine dream and he decides to tell it to his brothers. We remember the dream. They're going to bow down to him, and they hated him even more. And so he knew the pain of a dysfunctional family. Some of you know this pain. Maybe you like Joseph. Maybe you were the firstborn in your family. And so at your mom and dad's house, there's a lot of pictures of you. And then of all the siblings, it kind of gets less and less and less as each one comes along. Or maybe you were the sibling that mom and dad always compared everyone else to. Why can't you be more like her? Why can't you be more like him? The thing is, we sing the song, "There's no place like home for the holidays." And we look at those Thomas Kincaid pictures and think, oh, to sit around the table with our family. Let's be honest, for some people, family's not a good place to go. For some people, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, grandparents, it's a place of great strife. Some of you know that pain. Joseph knew that pain. The pain of a dysfunctional family, of not having peace or love or support from his own brothers. And then you add to this the pain of rejection. He is sent by his father one day to go check on his brothers, and it says in verse 23 of our context, it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. That pit was empty, without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. As they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." His brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. They planned to kill him. That's how deep their hatred had gone. But they decided instead they're going to throw him in a pit. They're going to sell him to traders and make a profit off of their brother. But you have to imagine now, we know his story. He was a father's favorite, and so as Joseph is thrown into the pit, and all this negotiation is taking place up top above, he's thinking, Dad's going to come. Dad'll come and set this straight. Dad'll come and rescue me. Just wait. They're in for it. Dad's going to come. Dad never came. Dad never came. All the way to Egypt, Dad never came. Rejected. Here's Joseph. He didn't necessarily ask to be hated. You might make the case that he shouldn't have shared those dreams, but in and of itself, did it warrant hate? Did it warrant abuse? Did it warrant being sold? Here's a man who knew the pain of rejection. Do you know that pain? Maybe you open yourselves out, trying to get close to someone, and you're immediately shoved back. You're rejected at work. You sought for promotion, and instead you're let go. Or maybe you tried to make a friend in a congregation, and that wall went up. Or maybe even in a marriage. Open yourself up for years only to find later on you're rejected. They were not faithful to your promises. The pain of rejection is a deep, sharp, and a bitter pain. And Joseph knew that pain. He travels all the way to Egypt, and for a moment, things are going well. He is bought by a man, the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguards, and he is entrusted with all the things in his house. This man finds favor in Joseph, sees the great things in Joseph that others saw, that he's trustworthy, he's a hard worker. And so things are going well until in verse 6, when we find at the end of verse 6 that Joseph is handsome in form and appearance, and it came about in verse 7 that in these, after the events of his master's wife, that she looked on with desire at Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, here with me, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There's no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie down beside her or be with her. She is a wicked woman. There's a reason we don't have her name. We're not going to name our daughters after her. No regard for God, no regard for her marriage or for her husband or the promise she made to this husband, no regard for Joseph, and let's be honest, no regard for herself. And yet put yourself in the shoes of this young 17-year-old boy far from home. And now you have a woman who's literally throwing herself at Joseph. You have to imagine the rationale going through his mind. No one would know. No one would know what's happening. Family's nowhere near. They probably don't even know I'm in Egypt. And to be honest, she has the power to control my life. She has the power to change things in my life. She's the master's wife. And yet none of that mattered. None of that mattered. Day after day, this wasn't a one-time thing. Day after day, this young man is tempted to do the very thing that would ruin his life, ruin his reputation, ruin his relationship with God. He knew the pain of trying to do the right thing day in and day out and yet be tempted to sin and turn against God. He knew that pain. He knew that suffering. And then he did the right thing, right? There's one day she literally grabs him. And then he does literally the next thing. He runs. He leaves his coat with her. Well, you have to answer then. Why do you have a guy's coat in your hands? And so she makes up this lie. Well, Joseph was the one who tried to force himself on me. And so it says in verse 20 of Genesis 39, Joseph's masters took him and put him into the jail in the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he was in the jail. Boy, you look at that. We've only covered 2 chapters in the book of Genesis, but really you've only covered 4 moments in Joseph's life. From into the pit to down into prison in Egypt, that was a quick trip, wasn't it? Now he's in a prison in a foreign country for doing the right thing, for running away from the master's wife. And maybe you've been there. Punished for doing the right thing. The boss says, "I want you to change the numbers. We're down a little bit, and if we turn this in, corporate's going to go ballistic. You just need to change a couple of things. I'll sign off on it." You do the right thing, and then they let you go. You try to tell someone who's in the wrong, "Hey, I noticed this. I just want to help you and encourage you." And then it ends up becoming an outright feud. And people take their side and say, "Why are you so angry? Why are you pointing your fingers? Why are you pointing out someone's sins? You need to stop judging. You're trying to do the right thing, and you suffer for it." Joseph knew that pain. And then let's just put the last one, disappointment. Because while he's in there, he has 2 interesting guests. There's the butler always does it, the cupbearer, and then there is the baker. And both of them have these dreams from God. Both of them have to do with their future. The baker's not going to live. He's going to die. The cupbearer will be released. God, through Joseph, interprets those dreams, but he tells the cupbearer, "Look, you're going to get out. You're going to go out and you're going to go back to Pharaoh. Hey, remember me. When you talk to Pharaoh, put in a good word for me. I did this for you. I interpreted your dreams. Do this for me." But you notice the last verse here in verse 40. "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." And we think, "Oh, it's only going to last a week." He'll remember surely. I mean, he's freed. He'll remember in a week. Give him a month. He'll sleep on it. He'll remember verse 1 of 41. It says, "Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream." 2 full years. "Oh, I'll remember you. I'll tell Pharaoh. Don't worry. I'll go. First thing when I'm out, I'm going to go straight to Pharaoh." 2 years later. But have you been there? "I'll do it for you. No problem. I'll be there 10 a.m. 10 a.m. No one's there. "I'll pray for you. Of course. Give me your problems. I'll pray for you." Where's the prayers? Have you been betrayed by the word of a friend? Have you had a promise broken by someone you thought you could trust? Joseph knew that pain. Do you see that downward spiral? Deeper, 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 until here he is, lost, alone, forgotten, and a prison in Egypt. That's hitting rock bottom, brethren. But you know what you see up here? Not only do we see our own situations, I'm sure many of you, as you look at this, you could say, "Yeah, I know that pain. No, I've not been in the prison in Egypt, but you know what? I know what it's like to be rejected. I know what it's like to be disappointed. I know what it's like to be tempted. Or I certainly know the pain of a dysfunctional family. You know what's interesting about all these sufferings? There's a common thread, common traits that we see in the sufferings that you and I understand. We've seen them. Like number one, sufferings come unannounced. I mean, who would have known going to his brothers that day, all he was doing was checking in on Dad, who would have known that checking in would end him up in a prison in Egypt? Who could have seen that coming? Had he known it, he would have said, no way, send Benjamin. I'm not doing that. I'm not going there. But isn't that life? I mean, you get a call one day from the principal and you're thinking, oh, my kid's got the honor roll. Says, no, your kid's in trouble. You got to come here now. You go to the doctor, you think it's just a routine checkup, and they say, actually, we found something. And they use that word, hit you in the gut, that C word. We found some cancer. You go into the boss's office and you think we're just going to talk about the quarter. He says, no, we're making cuts and you're the first to go. They don't come announced, they come unexpected. Especially some of you have been there when you get the phone call and it's the police, and it's not that your kid's in trouble, it's that your loved one, your kid, your spouse is killed in an automobile accident. They don't come announced, they come unexpected, and Joseph knew that. You also learn from Joseph that things got worse before they got better. They did get better. Eventually, he would be the second command in Egypt, one of the most powerful men in the world, but it took a long time to get there. Things had to get far worse before they got better. From the pit, to on the back of the trader's camel, to Egypt, as a slave, and then a prisoner. Finally, things turned around. But it was years before things got better. It was years before he'd see his dad again. And let's realize, for some of us, that's going to be the case. Think things are bad now? They don't always just turn around and get good immediately. Sometimes things get worse. Sometimes situations get harder before they even turn around and get better. It was for David. It was for Daniel. It was for Joseph. And it can be for us too. You also see that he bore some scars. We don't have the time today to trace this all down. His story is deep, but there's a time when he finally is in power and his brothers come back in. And it's not in the text, but you can read it. You can feel the tension. Joseph didn't forget. He didn't forget what they had done. Years had passed, but he didn't forget what they had done to him. And though he offers grace and though he offers forgiveness to his brothers, you can feel the tension in his heart. It was hard for him. It was hard not to retaliate. It was hard not to enact vengeance on his brothers. He bore the scars of what they had done to him in the past. And some of us, when we go through suffering, there are scars. Sometimes it's the empty chair. Or that one song, when you hear that song, all the memories come flooding back, and we're reminded of that pain of a loved one that's not here anymore. Sometimes it's emotional scars. Sometimes it's actual physical scars, walking with a limp, walking with a cane, parts of our bodies that are not the same. Do you know what I find interesting? When Jesus rose again, when he came to Thomas, he didn't just say, ta-da. He said, feel here. Touch where the nail was. Feel here and touch my side. You know that when Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't just heal over his skin, patch the holes. He didn't come out in this sort of glorious body that was free of all of its marks. He came out with scars. The scars from the cross, reminding them who touched it, yeah, he died for us. He was crucified for us. And yet, what a great proof as to who he was. We have scars, and scars remind us there's been pain in our past. We have fought some battles. We've gone through some hard times, but it reminds us also God saw us through then, because I'm alive. And as perhaps unappealing as scars might seem, they remind me God was with me then, and I made it through here. And if I made it through these scars then, God can be with me again today. Joseph had some scars. But really the main thing about Joseph that makes him so appealing to us is the fact that he never gave up on God. Of all the things, of all the excuses he had to turn on God, to look up at the heavens from that Egyptian prison and shake his fist and say, what did I do to you? What did I do to get this? Why am I being punished? I've been trying to do the right thing. Where are you, God? Or instead of saying, oh, this has happened to me, there is no God. There cannot be a God if this is happening to me. You see a man who maintained his faith and commitment to God. And Joseph got through it. Oh, it took a long time and it was not easy, but you know what? He made it through. And whatever it is that you have, that you are facing or will face in this life, if you remember that through God and through his power, Joseph made it through, remember, through God and through Christ, you'll get through this too. You'll get through this. Here's a few things to remember about this. In our sufferings, number one, just remember God is with us. Joseph, abandoned by his family, not found by his father, he wasn't alone. That's a neat commentary through the story of Joseph, is that even though Joseph was seemingly alone, no one was there with him, God was with him every step of the way. And so when things were going well, he named one of his sons after that very fact. He says the second he named Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. He knew it. I'm not alone. God's with me. That's the reason I'm so blessed. Even when he was in the house of Potiphar, it says the reason that he was so successful, it says the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him, so he became a successful man. Or in verse 5, it came about from that time that he made him overseer in the house and over all that he owned. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on the cord of Joseph. God was blessing him. God was with him. God was bringing him favor. And when he was in prison, the chief jailer, it says in verse 23 of Genesis 39, the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Do you see? God did not leave him alone in his suffering. God was with him every step of the way. Now, I want to ask you a question today. We need to ask the question that David asked in the book of Psalm 139. Psalm 139, verse 7, David asked a great question. It's a question we're considering here. David asked, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. I love these questions, don't you? If I go as high as I can go, up in the heavens, will you be there? If I go as deep as can go into the heart of the sea, even down to the depth of the land of the dead, Sheol itself, will you be there? If I travel as far east as possible, I wake with the sun and travel as far east as I can, or I go west, as far as the horizon can go, even there, God, will you be with me? What do you think Joseph would say if he was writing these questions? Even if I'm thrown to the bottom of a deep pit, even if I'm saddled on the back of a horse of a trader taking me I don't know where. Even if bought as a slave in a house of Egypt or thrown into an Egyptian prison, even there, God, will you be with me? What do we ask? Can you put yours there? Even if I have to go, Lord, to the unemployment office, the principal's office, the police station, if I must go to the ICU, the ER, the waiting room of a dangerous place, even if I must go to the nursing home or the funeral home or the graveside, even there, God, will you be with me? And David answers, even there, your right hand will lead me. Your right hand shall hold me. Even there. Can you put it in? Where? Where can you go? What can you endure? What can you face that God will not be there? Even as the psalmist would say, death itself, the deep, dark valley of the shadow of death, even if it's a loved one, and I'm having to let go of a loved one near and dear, or if it's my own mortality and I'm facing the inevitable, that I am facing my departure, the psalmist says, even there, even in those times, even in that place, I'm not going to be afraid because you're with me, and your rod and your staff shall comfort me. There's a great comfort, brethren, in realizing Joseph was all alone, but he wasn't alone. God was with him, and he took care of him. And there are times you will feel absolutely alone. You feel like no one knows what you're going through. No one can sympathize with your feelings. No one is there to care for you. No one is there to defend you. No one is there to stand up for your cause. And yet we know you're not alone. You are not alone in this. You're not alone in your suffering. You're not alone in your pain. You're not alone in this place of anguish. You are not alone. Even there, God is with you. He is with Joseph. He will be with you. I think we need to remember the fact that Christ gave us his example. I want you to turn in your Bibles. Leave Genesis and let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2, please. I want you to read a couple verses from 1 Peter chapter 2. Here in 1 Peter 2, Peter points us to the example of Christ, the suffering of Christ. He puts it in the context of greater suffering. When you're facing suffering from opposition, he points us to a powerful example given to us by God through Christ. 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 20, it says, "What credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure with patience? But if when you do what is right and you suffer for it, you would patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you've been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but he kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." He takes us to Calvary. He reminds us of the suffering of Jesus, the abuse of the Romans, the physical abuse on his body, the mocking of the crowd, the Jews who demanded the sign, "Come down from the cross." He points us to Christ, and I want you to notice a couple of things he says here. Number one, notice beginning verse 22, there's 4 things Jesus didn't do. He didn't commit sin. Verse 22. Not in his words, not in his mind. In all that he endured, Jesus did not sin. Verse 22, there was no deceit in his mouth, no lies, no hypocrisy. The King James Version says guile. There's no evil intent in anything that Jesus said from the cross. In fact, in verse 23, while being reviled, those who slung evil about him and harm and abuse, he did not revile in return, and while suffering, he uttered no threats. Jesus, not once did he say, "You're going to pay for this. Just wait till I come back. Just wait till the Father comes in 70 AD. You think this is bad? He's going to come get you." He uttered no threats. In fact, brethren, what's the one thing we all remember Jesus saying from the cross? "Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing." Peter points us to Christ. He says, look at him who suffered and look at his example. And the thing is, this is not unique to Calvary. This is not a one-time isolated event. How often in the Gospels was Jesus targeted by those who could not stand him, by the Jews? Remember, he was called a Samaritan by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees also said he's demon-possessed. And yet, when did Jesus curse them back? When did Jesus revile them in return? When did Jesus threaten them who threatened him? And so the point that he is making here is look at Jesus, who when sinned against did not sin in response, who when he was harmed did not retaliate. And the point he gets at is verse 21. You have been called for this purpose. Now, Ricky talked last week that we, the body of Christ, we are called out. 2 in verse 9, remember, he called out of darkness into his marvelous light. Peter connects it here and says, you've been called. There's a purpose for you. There's a plan God has for you, and that is not just to save you from your sin, but that you'll follow a different example, a new pattern, a new way of life. And part of that takes place in our suffering. When we've been targeted, when we are the recipients of abuse and harm, Peter says, you're to follow a new example, a new pattern, a new way of responding to these agitations in your life. And so when you are reviled, you're not to revile in return. When you are threatened against, you don't threaten back. You hear the language? You don't return evil for evil. And so when someone hurts you, you don't get even. You don't hurt them in response. You know why this is important, especially now? I imagine for many of you next week you're going to be gathered around with family. And sometimes family are the very people who say things that hurt the most. For some reason, family members have no filter, and they say whatever they want to say. And sometimes they don't mean it, and sometimes they do. And they can be hurtful and demeaning and low and insulting. It could be dishonest. It could be intending to cause you inward pain. What do we do? What do we do when we are insulted face to face, especially even by those who we love? Can you imagine something with me? Can you imagine in your mind? Don't get too worked up. We're going to change it here in a second. Just picture it. You're at the table. You're at the table, and there's a family member. You know it's coming. In fact, they've led the conversation to that point so they can make their punctuation right on you. And so they get ready and they lower the boom. You're a miserable father. You're a mess of a mother. Why don't you make more money? Why aren't you married? Where are the kids? And they lower their boom. Hit pause. They just insulted you to your face. Maybe they said something that's untrue and it's mean and hurtful in front of everyone. Hit pause. Take you out of the scene and let's put Jesus in your chair. And they just said that to Jesus and hit play. What's he do to your family member? Oh, I know. He smites him with boils right away. That's what he's doing to my family. Lightning and boils. What does Jesus do? Well, he who was reviled did not revile in return. And he who was threatened did not threaten. There was no sin in him, in his mind or in his mouth. Would it make a difference, brethren, if we lived like Jesus? If we bore the fruit of the Spirit? If we, as we've tried to do this year, became more like him? Would it make a difference in your homes? Would it make a difference around the holiday table? Would it make a difference as to how you handle times of suffering? One author wrote it this way. I want you to think about it. Here's what he said. He said, what if for 24 hours Jesus wakes up in your bed? He walks in your shoes. He lives in your house. He assumes your schedule. Your boss becomes his boss. Your mother becomes his mother. Your pains becomes his pains. With one exception, nothing about your life changes. Your health doesn't change. Your circumstances don't change. Your schedule isn't altered. Your problems aren't solved. One change occurs. What if for one day Jesus lives your life with his heart? What if your life is led by the heart of Christ? His priorities govern your actions. His passions drive your decisions. His love directs your behavior. What would you be like? Would people notice a change? Your family, would they see something new? Your coworkers, would they sense a difference? Would your friends detect more joy? Would your enemies receive more mercy? And you, how would you feel? How would Jesus running your life affect your stress level, your mood swings, your temper? Would you view death differently? Would you still do now what you're doing? With Jesus running your life, would anything change? Isn't that a good question? One day, 24 hours, my role was replaced by Jesus, and he assumes everything in my life. What changes? There's a reason I brought this up, good brethren. It connects us to Joseph. Do you understand that the majority of Joseph's sufferings were caused by someone beyond himself? They were caused by his brothers. It all began there. And then on and on and on. Potiphar's wife, the forgetful cupbearer, his suffering was caused by other people. And there are times you will have to deal with the sufferings, with the insults, with the bad actions of other people. And here's the thing, I get to choose. I get to choose, will I return fire? Will I retaliate? I get to choose what I let in my heart, what I let in my mind, what I'm going to let bother me. I get to choose what I let out, what words I'm going to say in response. And what Peter says is, remember, you were called for a purpose. Called out of darkness into his light, but that means you're called to be more like the light. Joseph had a chance and he didn't respond in hate. You have a choice. Every time the gun is drawn, every time the words are offered, every time the evil is slung, you have a choice. Will I respond in evil, or will I respond like Christ? Let God be honored. You'll get through this. You can make it through. But it's because you're looking at Jesus. And that's really our last point, is that there is hope. There's hope. If there's anything that helps us get through the dark, low moments of life or endure the pain suffered because of others, is it not the hope we have in Christ? In fact, in your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, for just a moment. If there's anything that gets us through these dark moments, it's realizing that this is not it. All that we see is not that there is, nor is it all that there will be. And so in Hebrews 11, the writer talks about those who lived before, the fathers of faith, the Abrahams and the Enochs and the Abels. And he goes on and he mentions Joseph and this company. But he talks about how they died in faith in verse 13 without receiving the promises. And the reason for such, in verse 14, was that they were making it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. If indeed they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have indeed had opportunity to return. But as it is in verse 16, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. They kept their eyes on something greater, something grander. This is not going to be it. This is not going to remain our home. This is not going to be the end of our story. There's something greater, and so we're pressing on, and we're enduring. And that's what Paul said. He said, the momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. If we can just for a moment look beyond the sufferings and the hardships of today to realize they are but a moment in the grander picture and the grander story. There's more than what we see here. Now let me say just a word. There are some who are going to be suffering this time of year. And it's not because of what others have done. It's not necessarily because of the physical pains in their life. This next week for many is some of the hardest days during the year because there's going to be a chair that's empty at the table. There's going to be someone's special chair that's not going to be filled this holiday season, and that hurts. In fact, we have some here that are going to be facing that for the first time. We as a church family need to be sensitive to that fact. While many of us are rejoicing, there are many who are mourning this time of year. And yet even still, can we remember what Paul says up on the screen? The full gamut of our suffering, Paul says, is nothing but light affliction. And that's hard to understand. Even mourning the loss of a loved one. Consider it to be light affliction in light of, he says, the day of glory that is to come. This is not all that there is. This is not all that will be. And thus, this is not the end of the story. The sadness and the heartache and the pain of today, one day, will be changed to a renewing and the unveiling of glory. And I know those are words. If we could just put a picture, right? A picture of what is to come. Oprah Winfrey had a segment on one of her shows called The Pictures That Made an Impact. And so she looked at the different pictures taken throughout U.S. history and those who made the biggest impact, those which seem to represent the greatest moments in American history. And there's one picture in particular. Colonel Robert Stern was a colonel in the Air Force, and he was flying during the Vietnam War, shot down, and was a prisoner of war. And his family never thought they'd see him again. But he survived. And the picture that they took of his return back to Travis Air Force Base, of as he and his family, his children, his wife, running with arms wide open to see their father they thought was dead, and now is very much alive. And when I see that picture, that's what I think of when I think of the day of glory to come. Arms wide open, tears running down our face because we see people we haven't seen in a long time. And we're there. We're finally there. And we're not going to be separated. We're going to be with him forever. The Lord himself, our King, there. Do you see the joy? Do you see the absolute happiness on their faces? You will get through this, whatever this is, because you're not alone. Because Christ suffered for you, showing you how you can do it. And because one day, this will be our day. And we'll be with our loved ones, and we'll be with the Lord forever. And so we sing, let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will all the toils of life repay when we all get to heaven. Well, what a day of rejoicing that'll be. When we all see Jesus, we will sing, and we will shout the victory. What a wonderful day that will be. Thank you so much for listening so well. We're going to be led in a prayer and then be dismissed to our Bible classes. If you're visiting here and you want to know where our classes are, let us help you. We have classes for all ages, but we want you to stick around and study with us. And so let's have our prayer, and we'll be dismissed to our classes. Thank you.